Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being with us. And this is the first Sunday of the year, the first Sunday of this January. And in religious science churches, now centers for spiritual living all over the world, there's a tradition that we go back to the basics. And by that, we mean we go right back to the very beginning of the Science of Mind textbook, to the very first chapter of the introduction, which is called The Thing Itself. Now, the reason that we do this is because hopefully we have grown. We have grown in the last year. We have changed. Our life experiences have gone in different ways. And we're not the same person we were a year ago. And the very simple idea is that whatever this thing is, we call it God, we can call it love, we can call it nature, we can call it spirit, whatever this thing is, whatever this presence is, whatever this power is, that which has preceded creation, that which precedes the words, but from which our words come from, whatever it is, we will never be done exploring it. Never. And infinity is a circle whose center is everywhere, whose circumference is nowhere. And the same is said of God. Our human minds are limited, and our human experience is limited. Everything that we experience at the human level has a beginning and a middle and an end. Everything that is born grows old and dies. Everything changes. So it's very, very difficult for us, coming from that limited view of the world, limited view of our existence, to even comprehend that which has no beginning and that which has no end. Joseph Campbell tells us that the word God is a metaphor for everything that transcends. It is a metaphor for that which transcends every limitation of human consciousness. Human consciousness understands time, but God is eternal. Human consciousness understands limits to power and to knowledge, but that which we call God is all-powerful and all-knowing. Human consciousness understands beginning, middle, and end, but that which we call God just is. So when we try to look at this thing itself, this thing we call God, this thing we call love, we want to understand then that we were always going to be discovering more of it. Always. Now, I'll qualify that. We're going to be discovering more of it if we look for it. If we don't look for it, we're not going to be discovering more of it. In other words, we can stay in the same place in consciousness for a long, long time, until something stirs within us, something moves us forward, something challenges us to seek. Something stirs within us. Now, that's something that is within us we don't put there. It was put there before we were born. But there comes a time when that glimmer starts, and we are compelled forward. We are moved forward. And we want to know. And we want to know just not from reading others' experiences, not from listening to other people telling us about their experiences, although that's an important part of our journey. We want to have the experience ourselves. The Sufis have a saying, it says, I don't want to be the sugar. I want to taste its sweetness. I want to taste its sweetness. We want to taste the sweetness of God. So this thing that compels us forward then is curiosity. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen movies particularly comedies, where every once in a while what the directors will do in order to emphasize a certain point or importance, it's kind of like all of the background actors freeze and go dark, and a spotlight comes on. When the spotlight comes on, whatever it is that they want to draw your attention to, whether it be the protagonist in the story or whether it be, you know, something else that's in the scene, but it's as if everything stops and this light comes on and it says, pay attention to this, pay attention to this. And I think all of us, we have those experiences. We kind of go through the week, and all of a sudden this same concept keeps coming up to us, the same idea keeps coming up to us. It reminds me, years ago, the TV show Candid Camera, when it was on, they did a skit where former President Harry Truman was still living in New York, and he went out every day for a walk. He would go out, and the Secret Service agents would go with him, and he pretty much walked the same route every day. So as a gag, what they did was they had an actress come out, and she was just dressed like a pedestrian walking down the street, and she was on the corner, and she was walking in the opposite direction, and Harry Truman passed her, and she stopped, and she said, "Well, good morning, Mr. President." And he politely returned her greetings. And then they put her in a cab or something. They ran her around the corner, and they dropped her off at the next corner that he was going to come to. And Harry Truman comes to the corner, and she says, "Well, good morning, Mr. President." He says, "Good morning." So they did this about 3 or 4 times, and then finally, you know, he could see him with this puzzled look at her, and he says, "What's going on here? You know, I've seen you before. Is this some kind of a joke?" You know, he got it. He figured it out. And of course, then they laughed and said, "You're on Candid Camera." My point is there's a time where we kind of go through a week, and then all of a sudden we kind of get these signs. It's like these big signs flashing, neon lights are flashing. And for me this week, that sign was curiosity. Curiosity. I was listening to a piece on the radio. One of the newsreaders in a radio program is retiring after 41 years with the network and after 30 years with the same program. And one of the things his colleagues said about him in his praise as he was retiring, that it was his kind of insatiable curiosity. You know, he was never satisfied. He always wanted to know more. He was always interested. He was always asking deeper questions. And his colleagues, you know, attributed that to his success in journalism. You know, that he could think of the questions that were important to know, and he would go and he would seek out the answers and he would dig them out. And it was this curiosity that made the program and made his career as successful as it was. And I started to think about that. You know, there's a lot, we're seeing a lot today in our public life, in the news media, you know, about news literacy and fake news. And there's kind of this movement by educators and newspaper people to teach news literacy in colleges and in schools. And they're starting with the assumption that, you know, people don't know how to read the news. They don't know how to tell whether what they're seeing is a factual news story or an editorial piece or an opinion piece, or is it true or is it not true? And they come to the conclusion that the answer to that is well, they're going to teach people how to become more news literate. And I think about that because I learned years ago, you know, don't ever go with the obvious. Don't just take the obvious conclusion and run with it, because it's usually wrong and it's usually going to be a waste of time. You know, it's gonna lead you places that we called it drilling holes in water. You feel like you're really doing something. You're making a lot of waves. Things are splashing, but as soon as you stop turning the drill, everything goes back to the way it was. So we had to force ourselves to ask why 5 times. And I started to think to myself, well, what is it, you know, if people are being exposed to all these different stories and they're not asking whether or not they're true, you know, how would I know if this is true? Why aren't they doing that? Why aren't they doing that? And I started to think, well, perhaps it's curiosity. Perhaps they get the information that agrees with what they already believe, and that's it. There's no need to go any further. And of course, curiosity, to me, I was thinking would be the thing that would say, well, that's one way of looking at it, but what's another? What are the other possibilities? How do I know what these people are telling me are true? Are these people who are telling it to me, are they trustworthy? All these kind of deeper questions, that come up from curiosity. So I started looking on the web. I searched for, can curiosity be taught? And if you want to check this out, that's what you search for. Can curiosity be taught? And it's a TED Talk. TED, capital T, capital E, capital D. I think it's Technology, Education, and Design. They have a series of seminars, talks, just basically all over the world, with lots of different people who are subject matter experts or put forward as subject matter experts in a particular field. This talk was given in Hong Kong, and it was by a university professor. And he started out and he said, as children, as little children, we are curious. We are just absolutely curious little creatures. Little children will crawl around, they'll pick things up, they'll put them in their mouth, they'll do everything they can to explore them. Sometimes they have good results, sometimes not so good results. I'm pulling a cat's tail, for example. If you're curious as what's going to happen, the baby learns quickly, don't do that. And the little ones are just full of questions. Just why? Why is the sky blue? Why is this? Why is that? All these questions. I think he gave a quote. He said that by the time a child hits the age of 5, they've already asked like 10,000 questions. This is how they learn. This is how they learn. I remember one time I was in a grocery store years ago, and there was a young mommy in there, and she had a little one, in the seat, in the grocery cart. The little one was maybe like 1.5, 2 years old. And she was going through the store with her grocery list, and she was getting her grocery order filled. And this little one was just so full of questions, What is the name of that fruit? What is that? Mommy would say, well, that's an orange. And he would say, well, what is that color? And she'd say, well, the color is the same as the name of the fruit. It's an orange. Oh. And they would move the cart like 6 inches. What is that? And she'd say, well, that's an apple. Oh, well, what color is the apple? And she'd say, well, the apple's red. And you could see the little wheels going. Well, if an orange is orange, how come the color of an apple is an apple, And they're just curious. They're just kind of asking these questions. And she was just so patient with this little one. So loving, It was not like, well, I'm busy. I've got to get my grocery list done. Just stop asking questions. But every question he asked, every single question. And I was only in their presence for, a couple minutes as I was passing by. She just patiently answered. I thought, there's a little one who's learning about life by asking questions. And he had a mom who entertained the answers, How wonderful is that? So get that picture of these little kids, these little kids asking questions and why this and why that, to the point, where sometimes as adults we just go, because I said so, because I said so. But think of what is driving them. What is it that is within them that makes them ask? That makes them want to know, that makes them want to explore, And they have such great imaginations, and they can kind of pretend, and they can kind of create these little pretend scenarios and kind of play these things out. What would it be like to walk on the bottom of the ocean? What would it be like to walk on the moon? Why isn't there any air there? And all these kind of things. And the professor went on to say that by the time the children get into middle school, they don't ask very many questions. And then by the time they get into high school, they ask very few questions. What has happened is that they have learned that in that system that they're in the school system, that asking questions that don't pertain to whatever is in the curriculum at that moment, that's it's considered a waste of time. Or why are you asking that? That has nothing to do with what we're talking about here. So very quickly the children learn, rather than to ask questions, the value is not on What questions can you think of? The value's on what answers can you remember? And they learn how to just look for that one right answer. This is the answer that the textbook wants. That's the answer I'm going to remember. I'll write it down on the test, and then I never have to worry about it again. And he quoted studies. So if you're interested in that, I suggest go look for the TED Talk on YouTube. And it's Can Curiosity Be Taught? And it was a TEDx talk at Hong Kong. The professor has a Chinese name. And he gave statistics, about how the level of questions, the rate of questions drops off. And he said, as a university professor, he gets the college freshmen in there, and he wanted to explore this idea some more. So he asked his students, he said, what were the things that you wondered as a child and you never got the answer to? What were the questions that you had? And he put these questions up, and here's these, now they're young adults, 18, 19-year-old kids, still kids to us, but I guess starting to become young adults. And he rekindled within them the questions that they had as a child, And one of the students remembered when she was a little girl, she had a question. What would happen if you played happy music to plants? That was it. Now you can just imagine a little child thinking of this, perhaps seeing something on TV, perhaps hearing something. But here's this little child saying, what would happen if we played happy music to plants? Would the music respond? And that's what she wanted to know. So what he did with the kids is he had them pick a question that they had wondered the answer to when they were a child, but they never got the answer to because, maybe somebody said, well, what good is that, And we do that in our world. We kind of cut ourselves off based on what's the practical value in that, Our society pretty much talks about Thomas Edison and all of his inventions and what a great inventor he was. But what they lose in that analysis is that Thomas Edison was interested in taking an idea, usually an idea that somebody else had, or frequently an idea that somebody else had, and he was interested in finding a practical application for it. So, for example, the light bulb. Everybody knows in this country. Everybody knows that Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, but did he really? There were patents for light bulbs before Edison came along. What Edison did was he found one that worked. Right? He continued experimenting until he found one that worked. And he knew that if he could find a light bulb that worked, that he could change the way that people lighted their homes. And he did. He invented what we call the Nickelodeon, which it was like a moving picture machine. You might have seen them in the arcades when you were a kid. You put your eyes in, it looked like a pair of binoculars. You put your eyes in them, and you turn a handle on the side, and there was a series of still pictures in there that just kind of went around, and they flipped very quickly. And because they flipped very quickly, it gave the illusion of motion pictures. And he invented that. And somebody said to him, if we could find a way to project this picture onto a wall, we could bring lots of people into a theater, and we could have them all watch the picture at once. And he said, no, he didn't really think that people would pay money to go sit in a dark room with perfect strangers and watch a movie. So he didn't pursue it. He sold the rights, I guess, to somebody else to go pursue it. So my point is that his curiosity was kind of slanted and filtered by what practical value is it? Can I see how we can make money out of this? And if he could see how he could make money out of it, he would pursue it. There's a quote attributed to him that when he was told that the Wright brothers had conquered heavier than air flight, he said, well, so what? You don't think people are going to go all around the country and put in fields for these contraptions to land, do you? So my point is that what we would call base research or basic research when I was in that industry, we would actually pay people to just go play in the labs. Let them go play with whatever they wanted to play with. Let them go try to discover whatever they wanted to discover. And they would find all of these things and they would file patents on them, and then somebody else would take those patents and somebody else in the company would say, now is there a way that we can make money off of this? Is there a way that we can make money off of this? So the unbridled curiosity went to the people who did the base research, right? The other people, they started to get more pragmatic. They started to be more pragmatic. They had to go in there and find, well, is there a way that we can use this? Is there a way that we can put this to work? So the teacher had the student, and the student had this question, what practical value is there to learning whether or not anything happens when you play happy music to plants? You can see people saying, well, what are we going to do? We're going to pipe Muzak into the field so that we get more tomatoes, or what are we going to do with that? We're not even going to worry about that. And that's my point, is sometimes our curiosity bubbles up, and then we say, what use is that? What value is that? And what the teacher was saying to the children, the value is in learning how to explore. Right? The value is in rekindling that passion, rekindling that desire to know more. So what he said to them was, take your question, take the question you want to work with, and then begin research like a scientist. Ask yourself, what other studies have been done? What other work exists that may have already answered this question for me? And look at that research, and of course you have to evaluate that and determine if it's credible or not. Is it an opinion? Is it actual research? Is there something in there that you can experiment with yourself? And then ask yourself, well, but where is the knowledge gap? What else would you need to know in order to satisfy your question? And don't waste time reinventing the wheel with things that other people have already discovered, that you've researched and determined that you accept their findings. But ask yourself, how would you experiment? How would you get in there, and how would you experiment in order to fill that knowledge gap? And he went on to say his point of his whole discussion was that when he did that, something ignited within the students. They found a passion, they found a reason, they found a purpose, And once they started to get their curiosity stirred up, things happened in that the one student came to him, and she actually found a plant out in a park. And there's a video of this in the YouTube clip. She found this plant in the park that if she talked nice to the plant started to move. And she's got a video of it. Now you've got to look at it, and you and I have to look at it and say, well, is somebody pulling a string? Are they blowing wind on it? All these kind of things that a reflective skeptic would have to do. But nevertheless, she says when she talks to this plant moves. And she has this little video of it. And then she wanted to know more. She said, well, what kind of plant is that? Do all plants of this species do it, or is it just this one particular plant that does it? And how does it do it, and why does it do it? And she found papers that were written by Darwin and his son about locomotion in plants and how plants move and how they change. And she's trying to understand what Darwin said and how that applies to what she's seeing going on in this plant. And she wanted to know what kind of plant it was, and the professor told her, well, you would have to know DNA, and you don't take DNA until the end of next year. And she says, I can't wait till the end of next year. And she went to the library and she learned what she needed to learn about DNA in order to find out exactly what kind of plant that was. And his point was that something was awakened within his students once they rekindled the curiosity that they had as children and they lost as they were growing up. Now, what does that have to do with going back to the basics, the thing itself? And I think it has everything to do with it. What were our questions about God when we were little children and growing up? What did you think God was? What did you want to know about God? And what were the answers that were given to you, and you were told that these are the answers that you need to remember because this is the way it is? I don't know how many of you had a similar experience, but certainly when I grew up, we had formal religious education called, catechism study. And the teacher would read the question, and then the teacher would give us the answer. Why did God make me? Well, God made me to love him and to serve him and to be happy with him forever. And we got the nod. Yes, that was the right answer. We needed to know that. And we went through that training for years, and then the bishop came and the bishop tested us on that and asked us questions. And if we knew the answer to the question, well, we got to move on to the next step. We got to go to confirmation. And the whole process was one of remembering the answers that we were given. But were those answers really satisfactory? Are they the answers that we should still hold on to today, or should we explore them further? What is this thing called God? What is life? Where did life come from? What are your questions, If God is good, why do bad things happen, right? Rabbi Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, the book of Job. Some of the very basic questions of life, what theologians would call the problem of evil. If God is good, why do children suffer? Where do we come from? Where do we go? Why are we here? These are the deep, deep questions of life. And the reason we come back to the basics every January is to energize ourselves, to go into another year of our spiritual growth. Building on where we have been, building on where we have come from, taking ourselves wherever we find ourselves right now, and saying, how do I want to grow this year? What do I want to learn this year? What do I want to learn about God? What do I want to experience about God this year? How will I know that I know? And then we can do as the professor suggested, well, what have other people had to say about this? What have other people written about this? What have other people taught about this? And don't take what they said as being absolutely true just because they said it. Well, certainly it may be true for them, or they may believe it to be true, or they may just be repeating something that they were told. But how would you know? See, how would you know that? What experiments could you use? How are you going to test that? And don't worry about whether it's practical or it's not practical, or if I'm going to make money off of it or I'm not going to make money off of it. We do, our society has done so much to kind of filter our thinking process into what it deems to be effective and efficient. What's the practical value for this? And if we don't see the practical value for it, then there is no value to it. We'll just get rid of it. There's a story, I don't know if it's true or not, but there's a story about people who lived in a mountainous area, and they found some kind of a curious red stone in the creek beds. And they used to collect these red stones and put them into mason jars and sell them to the tourists for $5 a jar. And they didn't realize what they had were rubies, that they lived in an area where the ground was full of rubies, and they were picking up precious gemstones. But they didn't know. They didn't ask. They just thought they were curious. They were red. They were pretty. What we've been taught in our world is that if we can't see a practical value for it, we shouldn't invest time in it. There's no reason to do something just for the sake of doing it. And we've also been taught that if it's not likely that you're going to find an answer, well, then why bother? I was talking to someone about this a couple of weeks ago, and I said, their position to me was there's so many things that we could possibly think of that we have to select just one or two that we can really do something with it and not worry about the rest. It's not, we're never going to do anything with it. And then their other point was, well, there's things that we'll never know, so we shouldn't even think about them. And I just kind of, thought to myself, you could say that about most anything that we have today, There were people who said we shouldn't think about building flying machines because it's never going to happen. There were people who said we shouldn't think about building ships large enough to cross the ocean because it was physically impossible to carry enough coal to make the trip. People who said, well, we can't go to the moon, we can't go into outer space. Almost everything that we have, in front of us, telecommunications, the internet, computers, at one time people believed to be impossible. So thank goodness somebody didn't say, well, I don't think we're ever going to solve that one, so why even look at it? It's that curious mind. It's that curious mind that said, I don't know what's going to come, but I'm going to go look. I'm going to go see. I'm going to go explore. And it's that attitude that we want to rekindle. We want to stir up within ourselves. I know I've shared this story before, but it's so perfect. I'm gonna share it one more time. Back in the 90s, when Lori and I were going through our training, preparing for the ministry, in that organization, the ministerial students and the practitioners taught Sunday school. And we had a curriculum. And so every Sunday we had this little curriculum of what the lesson plan was. We had activities, that usually involved kind of construction paper and glue and scissors and things like that. And we were told, the children don't have a long attention span. You can't just sit there and talk to them for an hour or so. You have to tell them a little bit, then give them something to do, and then tell them a little bit more. It was all quite prim and proper and laid out, And we didn't always have children come on a Sunday, and sometimes if they came, we only had one or two. So it was very hard to kind of take a child through a curriculum that had 4 parts if they only showed up for one of those 4 parts. But nevertheless, that's what we had to work with. And this one Sunday, this family came and they brought this little guy. He was 4 years old, and he's a grown man now. He's married and has children of his own. He's about 4 years old, and he came in, and they had been to the Discovery Science store at the mall. And he had a little pith helmet, he had a butterfly net, he had a specimen jar, and he had a magnifying glass. That's what they bought him the day before at the science store. And he came to Sunday school with it. And that's what he wanted. He wanted to explore, And I realized very quickly that whatever was in the curriculum was of no use, that construction paper and glue and scissors were not on his radar screen that day. He wanted to explore. He was the only kid that came for Sunday school that day. So we put on his pith helmet and we went out through the neighborhood. The place where the church met was in a residential neighborhood in Durham. But there were a few vacant lots around. And we went through the vacant lots, and we took his little magnifying glass, and we got down on our hands and knees, and we looked at the life on the ground. We looked at the ants. We looked at the insects, We looked at the blade of grass, and we looked at how the cells are all put together in the blade of grass. And while he's doing that, I'm talking to him about what created all of this. How did that blade of grass come to be? How is it that these insects know exactly what to eat? How is it that these ants know how to build a hill? Who taught them that, And all the time, all I was doing was just working with his imagination, working with his curiosity, and pointing him to something beyond that, something that had created all of that. I would wish that for this year, that as we begin this journey together, that we start with that childlike curiosity. We ask ourselves, wow, we are on a rock that is riding around a nuclear furnace. If you're standing at the equator, You're moving at the rate of 1,000 miles an hour as the earth spins on its axis, 1,000 miles an hour. And this was one of the arguments that the philosophers of old used to deny the fact or to discredit the idea that the earth was rotating. That if the earth were rotating at 1,000 miles an hour, you wouldn't be able to stand at the equator because the wind would be blowing too strong. The wind would be blowing at 1,000 miles an hour. But nevertheless, we now know that that air moves with the earth as the earth rotates. It moves on its axis at 1,000 miles an hour. It moves in its orbit, I don't know how many miles an hour it's moving. The sun is moving through the galaxy is moving through the universe, and the universe is moving through we don't know what. How fantastic is that? How fantastic is that? And here on this little blue marble, you've seen the pictures from Apollo when they took the pictures of the earth from the moon, and this little blue marble is just floating out there in the middle of nothing, in the middle of darkness. Here we are. Here we are. How did we get here? What is this thing? How does it work? So what we want to do is I invite you to read the introduction. Read the introduction. The first chapter of the introduction to the textbook, which is called The Thing Itself. Read it and consider the ideas that Dr. Holmes tosses out. But then ask yourself, well, how would I know? How would I know? You know, we start with the assumption that there is this presence in the universe, but how would we know? We start with the assumption that this presence is a unity and a singularity, but how would we know? How would we know? We start with an assumption that the way it creates is by the power of thought, that it consciously chooses what it will have, and then there's a power that acts unconsciously as a law that brings that into fruition, that makes it so, that takes the invisible stuff and substance of the universe and brings it into shape of form and matter. And how would we know? And how would we know? One of the very basic tenets of religious science is there's a power in the universe that responds to us exactly according to our belief. And you have to ask yourself, well, how would I know? How would I know that? What experiments could I perform? Remember, this is why he called us religious scientists. He said we should be able to prove. We should be able to prove these things. We should be able to experiment with these things. What were your questions about God when you were a child? What were the things that you wanted to know that were never answered to your satisfaction? Perhaps because you didn't ask. You might have thought it would be silly to ask. Maybe people would tell you there's no value. Why are you asking those things, you know? Maybe the answers that you got were pat answers. Well, this is what the book says. And you need to accept that because we're going to test you on that. Maybe the way that you understood the answer as a child was an incomplete understanding. Maybe it's time to update your understanding. And that's why we come back every year. We come back to the basics. It's time to update our understanding. What is this thing called life? What is this thing called God? What is this thing called nature? This thing called love? This thing called power? Whatever you choose to call it, spirit. The Tao. What is it? And then, what am I that it is mindful of me? Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? I think we reach a point in our growth, and I call our growth our constant inquiry, our constant desire to experience more of what God is. But not just at an intellectual level, but an actual experiential level. And our growth is every day, every week, every month, every year, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. You know, we live on the East Coast. Most of us do. We live on the East Coast. And we have all probably had the experience of swimming in the Atlantic Ocean. But we really didn't swim in the entire Atlantic Ocean. We swam in a little piece of the Atlantic Ocean, in a little beach wherever we lived, if it was off the coast of North Carolina or Florida or South Carolina, or New York. We went out and we stood in the ocean, and we probably stood in the ocean about waist high, you know. And we swam around a little bit, waves knocked us down, and then we came up on the shore and sat on our blanket, dried off. The ocean is much greater than that little experience that we had. But we can only know as much as we have experienced. We only know that little part of it. We only know that part that we have been immersed in, that we have interacted with. And I want you to think of this thing called God in the same way. It is much bigger than we will ever know, much greater than we will ever know. Our finite minds cannot comprehend the infinite. But whatever we will know of it, we can only know right here, where we interact with it in our experience of it, its experience as us. And our quest then is to awaken within ourselves that insatiable desire to know more of God. To seek God as if we would be seeking the pond if our hair was on fire. To seek God as the only thing. To allow nothing else to distract us, because nothing is more important. All of these practical things that we have been told to worry about growing up, getting a job, making a living, building a house, all of these things, they're all going to go. They're all going to turn to dust, every one of them. Every one of them. But what will continue forever is our consciousness. And forever our consciousness of God will be growing and expanding. But it will only do so if we have the prerequisite curiosity. Why did God make me? Is there a God? How does God work? What does God do? How will I know? How will I know? What have other people said, and how do I know what they said is true? What is the knowledge gap that exists? What can I do to close that gap? How can I have the personal experience? How can I get into that part of the ocean that is right near where I am? How can I experience God right where I am, since it is everywhere present? How can I grow? So I invite you this week, please take an opportunity to read the introduction, the first chapter of the introduction to the textbook, and look at the ideas that Dr. Holmes puts forth. We're going to talk about them more for the next couple of weeks as these 4 chapters kind of interweave and overlap. We will talk about them more. What I had hoped to do today was to just invite you to go back to that child within, the curious little one, the little one that would be in the grocery store with mommy pushing the cart and saying, what is that? Why is it that color? What is that? Why is it that color? The little child with the pith helmet and the magnifying glass going out into the neighborhood, into something so familiar that we all drive by it every day and pay no attention. And finding the activity in the presence of God in an anthill. It is nearer than our hands and feet. It is closer than our breath. Dr. Holmes tells us we look too far away for God and we make the quest too hard. It is right here. It is right now. The only question we need to really consider is, do we have enough curiosity to look for it? And I hope this year we have more than we had last year. And this year is a year of phenomenal growth for each and every one of us. So it is.